One engineer, one radical idea, and a war. Plan the Reich thought was invisible. The rain hammered against the blackout. Curtains of a third-floor office in Whitehall, as a young man with thick spectacles and disheveled hair spread a collection of seemingly unrelated documents across his desk. It was past midnight on November 11th, 1940, and Dr. Reginald Victor Jones had not slept properly in 72 hours. The documents before him told an impossible story. German bombers were striking British targets with an accuracy that defied every known principle of aerial warfare. They were bombing through clouds, through darkness, through weather that should have made precision targeting utterly impossible. And they were doing it not occasionally, not by luck, but systematically, repeatedly, with a consistency that could only mean one thing. They could see something the British couldn't. But how do you see through clouds? How do you navigate with pinpoint accuracy when there are no landmarks, no stars, no reference points whatsoever? The answer, Jones had begun to suspect, lay not in the visible spectrum at all. It lay in radio waves, in invisible beams of electromagnetic radiation that could slice through weather and darkness as easily as light passes through glass. The problem was that no one believed him. Not the Air Ministry, not the senior commanders, not even his fellow scientists. Radio beams that could guide aircraft across hundreds of miles with meter-level precision. It was the stuff of science fiction, not military reality. Yet here sat Jones, surrounded by intercepts that mentioned beams, with technical diagrams from crashed aircraft showing unusual radio receivers, with reports from interrogated German pilots who had let slip references to flying on the beam, before realizing their mistake and clamming up. Somewhere in this puzzle was a secret that could change the entire war. Hitler had developed a technological marvel, a weapon that rendered Britain's natural defenses, darkness, weather, distance, completely irrelevant. And if Jones couldn't convince the military establishment that this impossible thing was real, if he couldn't find a way to counter it, then every British city, every factory, every military installation was vulnerable to destruction. The Reich had found a way to strike with impunity, guided by invisible rails in the sky that only they could follow. Jones pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began sketching. If the Germans could create invisible beams, then perhaps the British could learn to see them. Perhaps they could even bend them, twist them, turn Hitler's greatest secret weapon against itself. It would require innovations in radio technology that had never been attempted. It would require proving that the impossible was not only possible but already operational. And it would require convincing a roomful of skeptical military officers that a 28-year-old physicist had unraveled a secret that the entire German military-industrial complex had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. The story of how one man's radical idea exposed Hitler's hidden strategy begins not in that rain-soaked London office, but 3 years earlier in the heart of Nazi Germany, where a team of brilliant engineers had been working on a problem that had vexed military planners since the invention of the airplane: how to accurately bomb a target you cannot see. In the summer of 1937, the landscape of military aviation was undergoing a profound transformation. The Spanish Civil War had become a proving ground for new technologies and tactics, and one lesson had emerged with brutal clarity. Precision bombing was nearly impossible. Bombers equipped with the best optical bomb sights available could achieve reasonable accuracy in perfect conditions: clear skies, daylight, minimal defensive fire. But remove any of those conditions, and accuracy plummeted. At night, in clouds, or under the stress of anti-aircraft fire, bomber crews were essentially dropping their payloads blindly, hoping to hit something important. This presented both a problem and an opportunity for the Luftwaffe's technical directorate. Germany's strategic doctrine relied heavily on the bomber as an offensive weapon. The concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, envisioned rapid strikes that would paralyze an enemy's ability to resist before ground forces even engaged. But this strategy only worked if bombers could reliably destroy their targets. Airfields, communication centers, factories, transportation hubs. Missing these targets by even a few hundred meters could render an entire bombing campaign useless. The problem was even more acute because Germany's most likely adversaries, France and Britain, had extensive anti-aircraft defenses. Bombers operating in daylight faced withering fire. Night bombing offered protection but sacrificed accuracy. What the Luftwaffe needed was a way to guide bombers to their targets with precision, regardless of visibility or weather. They needed a system that could function in total darkness, through clouds, through smoke, through any conditions that might obscure visual navigation. And they needed it to be simple enough that average pilots could use it under combat stress. The solution emerged from the German telecommunications industry, specifically from the Lorenz company, which had been developing radio navigation aids for commercial aviation. Lorenz had created a system called Lorenz Beam that used radio signals to help commercial aircraft land in poor visibility. The principle was elegantly simple. A ground-based transmitter broadcast two overlapping radio beams. In one beam, the signal consisted of Morse code dots. In the other, dashes, where the beams overlapped precisely along the center line of a runway. The dots and dashes merged into a continuous tone. A pilot wearing headphones could simply follow this tone, knowing that as long as the tone remained steady, he was perfectly aligned with the runway. Dr. Hans Plendl, a physicist working with the Telefunken company, recognized that this civilian technology could be adapted for military purposes. If you could guide an aircraft along a beam to a runway, why couldn't you guide it along a beam to a target? The technical challenges were substantial. A beam precise enough to guide an aircraft over just a few miles to a runway would spread out over longer distances, becoming too wide to provide accurate guidance. Radio waves naturally diffuse as they propagate, and the curvature of the Earth meant that beams would eventually diverge from the ground, shooting uselessly into space. But Plendl was a creative thinker. He realized that you didn't need a single beam to remain narrow over hundreds of miles. Instead, you could use multiple beams intersecting at specific points. A bomber could fly along one beam, the approach beam, and when it crossed a second beam, the pilot would know with precision that he had reached a specific geographic location. By using multiple crossing beams, you could create a series of waypoints in the sky, invisible markers that guided an aircraft along a precise path to its target. The Telefunken team began developing what would become known as Nickebein, which translates roughly as crooked leg or dog leg, referring to the bent path an aircraft might take while following intersecting beams. The system used two main components: ground-based transmitters in Germany or occupied territory that generated narrow radio beams at specific frequencies, and simple receivers installed in bombers that could detect these beams and provide audio feedback to the pilot. The genius of Nickebein lay in its simplicity. The pilot didn't need to understand radio theory or perform complex calculations. He simply wore headphones and listened. When he heard dots, he knew he was to the left of the approach beam and needed to bank right. When he heard dashes, he was to the right and needed to bank left. When he heard a steady tone, he was perfectly centered on the beam. He would fly along this beam, maintaining the steady tone until his receiver picked up a second beam crossing the first. At that intersection point, which could be calculated in advance to coincide precisely with a target, he would release his bombs. The system was tested extensively in 1938 and 1939. Initially, trials were conducted over Germany itself, with bombers using Nickebein to navigate to test ranges. The results exceeded expectations. Pilots with minimal training could follow beams with extraordinary precision, even in total darkness, even in weather that made visual navigation completely impossible. Aircraft could reach predetermined points with accuracy measured in hundreds of meters. Not kilometers, but the Telefunken engineers weren't satisfied. Knickerbein had limitations. The beams, while narrow, still spread over long distances. The accuracy was good, but not good enough for striking small, hardened targets like bridges or specific factory buildings. And the system required pilots to manually release bombs at the moment they detected the crossing beam, which introduced human error and variation in reaction time. This led to the development of a second, more sophisticated system, X-Jurat, or X-device. Where Knickerbein was simple, X-Jurat was ingenious. It used not 2 beams but 5, 1 main approach beam and 4 crossing beams. As a bomber flew along the approach beam, it would cross the first crossing beam at a predetermined distance before the target. This would trigger an alert to the pilot. Prepare for bombing. Shortly afterward, the aircraft would cross a second beam. This would automatically start a clock in the bombing equipment. The third beam would stop the clock. Here's where the system became truly revolutionary. By measuring the time between the second and third beams, the equipment could calculate the aircraft's ground speed with precision. This was crucial because the time a bomb takes to fall, and where it lands relative to the release point, depends heavily on the aircraft's speed. A bomb dropped from an aircraft flying 200 miles per hour will land in a different location than one dropped from an aircraft flying 250 miles per hour, even if both are released at the exact same geographic point. With the ground speed calculated, the X-Jurat equipment could determine the exact moment the bombs needed to be released to strike the target. When the aircraft crossed the fourth and final beam, the release beam, the system would automatically drop the bombs without any action from the pilot. The entire process was automated, removing human error from the equation. X-Jurat was accurate to within tens of meters over distances of hundreds of kilometers. It was, by the standards of 1939, an astonishing achievement. A bomber equipped with X-Jurat could take off from France, fly through complete darkness and cloud cover over England, and drop its bombs on a specific building in a British city, all without the pilot ever seeing the ground. Development of these systems was conducted under intense secrecy. The German High Command recognized that radio navigation was a potential war-winning technology, but only if enemies didn't know it existed. Knickerbein and X-Jurat equipment was installed in aircraft under stringent security protocols. Pilots and navigators were trained on the systems only at secure facilities, and they were strictly forbidden from discussing the technology even with other Luftwaffe personnel not directly involved. When aircraft equipped with the beam systems were shot down, flight crews were instructed to destroy the radio equipment before bailing out. The technology was compartmentalized to an extraordinary degree. Yet secrecy in wartime is always imperfect. As the Luftwaffe prepared for conflict with Britain and France, more aircraft needed to be equipped with beam receivers, more pilots needed training, more ground stations needed to be constructed. Each expansion of the program increased the risk of intelligence leaks. German engineers and scientists, brilliant as they were, could not have anticipated that Britain would develop its own technological marvel specifically designed to detect and counter radio navigation systems. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the beam systems were operational but not yet deployed against Western targets. The Polish campaign was swift, and precision bombing was less critical against an enemy with limited air defenses. But as German attention turned westward to France and Britain, planners began incorporating Knickerbein and X-Jurat into operational plans. The strategic vision was breathtaking in its ambition. German bombers would be able to strike British targets regardless of weather, regardless of darkness, regardless of British defensive measures. The Royal Air Force's fighter defenses were formidable during daylight, but at night they were nearly helpless. British fighters relied on ground controllers vectoring them toward enemy bombers. But in the darkness, and with primitive radar systems, this was desperately inefficient. Most night intercepts failed. Most German bombers reached their targets unmolested. Now, combine British inability to defend against night bombing with German ability to bomb with precision at night, and you had a recipe for devastation. The Luftwaffe could systematically dismantle British industrial capacity, destroy RAF airfields, flatten military installations, and terrorize civilian populations, all while suffering minimal losses. The beam systems represented more than just tactical advantages. They represented a fundamental shift in the nature of air warfare. For the first time in history, bombing could be truly strategic, focused, consistent, cumulative. Previous bombing campaigns had been essentially harassing attacks, destructive but not decisive. With beam navigation, bombing could be surgical, targeting the specific nodes that kept a nation's war machine functioning. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, securing territory that extended the range of beam transmitters. In May, the invasion of France began, and within weeks, German forces had captured Channel Coast territories that provided ideal locations for beam transmitters targeting Britain. Engineers moved quickly to establish ground stations. By July 1940, as the Battle of Britain began in earnest, the beam system infrastructure was in place. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that British intelligence had already picked up hints that something unusual was happening. Interrogations of shot-down German pilots had produced strange references to radio landing systems that seemed far more sophisticated than should be necessary. Captured aircraft contained radio equipment that British technicians found puzzling, receivers that seemed over-engineered for simple communications, and signals intelligence had intercepted German messages containing cryptic references to beams, to coordinates, to guidance systems. None of this evidence was conclusive. None of it proved that Germany had developed precision radio navigation for bombing. But it was enough to reach the desk of a young scientist who had been recruited to British intelligence specifically to investigate German technical capabilities. And that scientist, Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, had a gift for seeing patterns. Where others saw only noise, the stage was set for one of the most consequential technological battles of the Second World War. On one side, the might of German engineering, backed by substantial resources and a head start of several years. On the other, a small team of British scientists who would have to unravel a secret they weren't supposed to even know existed, then find a way to counter technology they had never seen, all while bombs fell on their cities. The beam war was about to begin, though neither side yet realized the full implications of what was coming. Dr. Reginald Victor Jones had never intended to become a spy. Born in 1911 in Dulwich, South London, he had followed a path marked by academic excellence and a deep fascination with physics. He studied at Oxford, where his research focused on infrared detection and spectroscopy. By his mid-20s, he had established himself as a promising experimental physicist with a particular talent for instrumentation, designing devices that could detect and measure phenomena at the limits of technological capability. This expertise caught the attention of British intelligence in 1939. As war loomed, the British government recognized that modern warfare would increasingly depend on technology, and understanding enemy technical capabilities would be crucial. The Secret Intelligence Service began recruiting scientists who could analyze technical intelligence. Photographs of enemy installations, captured equipment, intercepted communications containing technical details. Jones was approached in the summer of 1939 and offered a position as a scientific advisor to air intelligence. He accepted, more out of patriotic duty than enthusiasm. The work seemed like it would involve reviewing dry technical reports, far from the hands-on experimental research he loved. He could not have imagined that within months he would be at the center of one of the war's most critical secret campaigns. Jones's first weeks at the Air Ministry were indeed somewhat tedious. He reviewed reports on German aircraft performance, examined photographs of Luftwaffe airfields, and analyzed intelligence about German aircraft production. But in November 1939, something landed on his desk that jolted him out of routine. A decrypt of a German message that mentioned X-Jurat, and referenced beam guidance systems. The message was fragmentary, translated from technical German by intelligence officers who didn't fully understand the terminology they were working with. But certain phrases leaped out at Jones: beam intersection, automatic release, range calculation. These weren't vague references. These were specific technical terms that suggested a sophisticated radio navigation system. Jones began pulling together every piece of intelligence that might relate to German radio navigation. He requested archives of interrogation reports from captured airmen. He asked for technical analysis of radio equipment recovered from crashed German aircraft. He reviewed signals intelligence looking for any reference to beams, guidance, or navigation systems. What emerged was a mosaic, incomplete but suggestive. Several shot-down German pilots, when pressed by interrogators, had made references to special navigation equipment. Most had refused to elaborate, but a few had let slip details before realizing they were revealing sensitive information. One pilot had mentioned following the beam during training. Another had referred to automatic bombing equipment. A third had described a system where the aircraft tells you when you're at the target. Recovered radio equipment was puzzling. British technicians. German bombers carried receivers operating at frequencies that didn't correspond to standard communication channels. The receivers were highly directional, with antennas designed to pick up signals from specific angles rather than omnidirectionally. This made sense for a navigation system. You'd want to receive signals from ground stations, not from all directions, but it was unusual for simple communications. Jones synthesized all this information and arrived at a hypothesis that seemed almost absurd. The Germans had developed a radio beam system that allowed bombers to navigate to targets with precision in any weather. When he first articulated this theory to colleagues, the reaction was skepticism bordering on dismissal. Radio beams can't work over long distances, one senior officer told him flatly. The curvature of the Earth disrupts them. Any beam would diffuse to uselessness within a few dozen miles. Jones had anticipated this objection. Unless, he replied, the Germans are using very high-frequency transmissions with highly directional antennas. At VHF frequencies, you can create narrow beams, and if you use multiple beams intersecting, you don't need any single beam to remain narrow over hundreds of miles. You just need beams to cross at predetermined points. That's theoretically possible, admitted another scientist present. But the engineering challenges would be enormous. The transmitters would need to be incredibly powerful and precisely calibrated. The receivers would need to be extremely sensitive. And the whole system would need to be integrated into bombers in a way that pilots could actually use. It would take years to develop such a system. Precisely, Jones said quietly. Which means if the Germans have this system operational now, they must have been developing it for years. Long before the war started, this isn't something they improvised. This is a planned strategic weapon. The implications silenced the room. If Jones was right, the Germans had anticipated the coming war and had invested substantial resources into developing a capability that would give them an overwhelming advantage. They had solved a fundamental problem of air warfare: how to bomb accurately at night. And they had done so in secret. But the skeptics weren't ready to concede. "Where's your proof?" demanded Air Vice Marshal Philippe Joubert de la Ferté. "You've shown us intercepts that mention beams, but that could refer to anything. You've told us about unusual radio equipment, but we don't know what it does. You've cited pilot statements that are vague and fragmentary. None of this proves the existence of an operational navigation system." Jones had to admit the officer had a point. Everything he'd presented was circumstantial. To convince the military establishment and to develop effective countermeasures, he needed direct evidence. He needed to detect the German beams themselves. He made a bold proposal. "Give me an aircraft equipped with sensitive radio receivers. Let me fly search patterns over Britain, monitoring the frequencies where I believe these beams operate. If the beams exist, we'll find them. And once we've found them, we can analyze their characteristics and figure out how to counter them. There was reluctance. Aircraft and trained crews were scarce resources. Diverting them to what many still considered a wild goose chase seemed wasteful. But Jones had one powerful ally. Henry Tizard, the chairman of the Aeronautical Research Committee and one of Britain's most respected scientists. Tizard had a track record of supporting unconventional ideas that proved crucial. He had been instrumental in developing radar, and he recognized in Jones the kind of creative thinking that solved problems others didn't even see. "Give Dr. Jones's aircraft," Tizard said with finality. "If he's wrong, we've wasted a few nights of flying time. If he's right, we've uncovered a threat that could determine the outcome of the war." Within days, Jones had his search platform, an Avro Anson aircraft fitted with radio receivers and direction-finding equipment. The crew was briefed on the mission but not told the full scope of what they were looking for. The beam project was already highly classified. They were simply instructed to fly specific routes over Britain, monitoring assigned frequencies and noting any unusual signals. For 3 nights, the search came up empty. The crew flew patterns over industrial centers in the Midlands, over London, over southern ports. They monitored the frequencies Jones had identified as most likely for beam transmissions. They heard nothing unusual, just the normal radio traffic of wartime Britain, occasionally punctuated by German communications that were already being monitored by signals intelligence. Jones began to doubt himself. Perhaps his theory was wrong. Perhaps the intercepted references to beams meant something else entirely. Perhaps the unusual radio equipment had a mundane explanation he hadn't considered. The skeptic's arguments echoed in his mind. He was a scientist, trained to follow evidence, and the evidence wasn't materializing. Then, on the 4th night, December 21st, 1939, everything changed. The Anson was flying over Derby in the English Midlands when the radio operator suddenly signaled the pilot. He'd detected something unusual. A steady, narrow-band signal at 31.5 megahertz, the low end of the VHF spectrum. The signal was coming from the east, from Germany, and it was highly directional. More importantly, it had characteristics consistent with a navigation beam. The radio operator described what he was hearing through his headphones. Not simple Morse code or voice communication, but a pattern of dots and dashes that alternated depending on the aircraft's position relative to the signal source. When the Anson banked left, the operator heard dots. When it banked right, dashes. And when the pilot held a specific heading, the dots and dashes merged into a continuous tone. Jones, monitoring reports back at the Air Ministry, felt a surge of vindication mixed with dread. This was exactly the signal pattern you'd expect from a Lorenz-type beam system. The Germans were broadcasting a narrow radio beam across Britain, and that beam could guide aircraft with precision to specific locations. Over the following nights, the search intensified. Additional aircraft joined the effort, and they began mapping the beams systematically. What they discovered was more extensive than Jones had feared. Multiple beams crisscrossed Britain, emanating from transmitters along the European coast. The beams converged on British cities and industrial centres: London, Birmingham, Coventry, Bristol, Manchester, Liverpool. Every major population centre and strategic target had beams pointing at it. The beams were Nicobine. Jones hadn't yet detected the more sophisticated X-Juret system. That would come later. But Nicobine alone was enough to represent a profound threat. The Germans had infrastructure in place to guide hundreds of bombers to targets across Britain with far greater accuracy than should have been possible. Armed with this evidence, Jones called another meeting with military leadership. This time the atmosphere was different. He wasn't presenting a theory. He was presenting data. He showed them plots of beam directions, frequency measurements, signal characteristics. He explained how the system worked, how pilots could follow beams to targets, how multiple beams could create intersection points for precision bombing. "Gentlemen," Jones concluded, "the Germans have solved night bombing. They can strike any target in Britain regardless of weather or visibility. Their accuracy won't be perfect. There's still variation due to altitude, wind, and other factors, but they can put bombs within a few hundred meters of any designated point. And based on the number of beams we've detected and the infrastructure required to generate them, this isn't an experimental system. It's operational and ready for large-scale use. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Britain's defensive strategy had been built on assumptions that were now revealed as false. The RAF had concentrated resources on daytime fighter defense, expecting that night operations would be ineffective enough to be manageable. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned to defend against raiders they could see or track with rudimentary radar. Civil defense plans assumed that bombing would be inaccurate, dispersed, harassing rather than concentrated. All of those assumptions had just been invalidated. The Germans could bomb at night with something approaching daylight accuracy. They could concentrate attacks on specific targets, factories, power plants, transportation hubs, and actually hit them consistently. They could bypass Britain's fighter defenses and strike with relative impunity. "Can we stop them?" asked Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, the architect of Britain's fighter defense. His voice was steady, but Jones could hear the tension beneath. Dowding had just won the Battle of Britain through brilliant use of radar and fighters to defeat daylight raids. Now, he was being told there was a night threat his system couldn't address. "Not directly," Jones admitted. "We can't shoot down bombers we can't find, and finding bombers at night is exceptionally difficult even with radar. But we might be able to make the beams useless. If we understand how the system works, we can develop countermeasures. We can jam the beams, or better yet, we can manipulate them. Feed false information to German pilots so they think they're on target when they're actually miles away." "How long would that take?" Dowding pressed. Jones hesitated. He was a scientist, not a military planner, and he understood that wars weren't won by timelines that began with "theoretically" and ended with "if everything goes perfectly." But he also understood that sometimes you had to commit to seemingly impossible deadlines because the alternative was accepting defeat. "Give me a team of engineers and radio specialists. Give me authority to requisition equipment and establish monitoring stations. Give me access to all intelligence on German radio technology." He paused, calculating. 2 months. I can have basic countermeasures operational in 2 months. More sophisticated systems will take longer. But we can start degrading the accuracy of German bombing within 2 months. It was an audacious claim, and Jones knew it. He was proposing to reverse engineer a system the Germans had spent years developing, then create effective counter-technology, all in 8 weeks. But the alternative, allowing the Germans to bomb with precision while Britain remained helpless, was unthinkable. Dowding glanced at Teasard, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Then he looked back at Jones. "You have your team, your authority, and your 2 months, Dr. Jones. Britain is counting on you, even though most people will never know it." As the meeting adjourned and officers filed out, Jones remained at the table, staring at the charts showing beam patterns across Britain. He had just committed himself to what might be an impossible task. He would need to assemble specialists who understood radio engineering at the highest level. He would need to establish a network of monitoring and jamming stations across Britain. He would need to test countermeasures without tipping off the Germans that their secret had been discovered. And he would need to do all of this while German bombers could begin using the beams for precision attacks at any moment. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders. People's lives, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, would depend on whether he could deliver on his promise. Cities would burn or be saved based on whether his countermeasures worked. The course of the war might hinge on this invisible battle being fought in the radio spectrum. Jones gathered his papers and walked out into the cold London night. Overhead, stars were visible through a break in the clouds. In peacetime, those stars had guided navigation for millennia. Now, invisible radio beams were replacing them, and Jones had just volunteered to fight a war in the electromagnetic spectrum that most people didn't even know existed. He had 2 months. The clock was ticking. The team Jones assembled was an eclectic mix of talents pulled from universities, telecommunications companies, and military research establishments. There was Dr. Robert Cockburn, an expert in radio transmission who had worked on early radar systems. Charles Frank, a young physicist who became Jones's closest collaborator and sounding board. Engineers from the BBC's transmitter division who understood high-power radio broadcasting. Mathematicians who could calculate beam propagation patterns. Technicians who could build custom equipment under tight deadlines. They set up operations in a requisitioned building in Richmond, southwest London, that quickly became known as the Beam Boffin's Lair. The security was tight. Guards checked credentials at multiple points, and visitors needed special clearance even to know the building existed. Inside, the atmosphere was part laboratory, part workshop, part military command post. Oscilloscopes and radio receivers crowded workbenches alongside hand-drawn maps of beam patterns. Blackboards were covered with mathematical equations describing electromagnetic propagation. Telephone lines connected to RAF stations, signals intelligence centers, and the Air Ministry ran along walls in tangled bundles. The first challenge was understanding nicobine in complete detail. Jones's team had detected the beams and understood the basic operating principle. But to counter a system effectively, you need to know its weaknesses. They needed to answer questions like, how narrow were the beams at various distances? How stable was the signal strength? What frequencies could the system use? How sensitive were the aircraft receivers? What would confuse or degrade the system? To answer these questions, they needed to do more than just detect beams. They needed to fly through them, measuring signal characteristics with precision. The RAF provided additional aircraft fitted with increasingly sophisticated radio measurement equipment. Night after night, these aircraft flew systematic patterns through the German beams, cataloging data. What they discovered was both impressive and exploitable. The German beams were remarkably narrow considering the distances involved, only a few degrees wide, even hundreds of miles from the transmitter. This explained how the system could provide accurate guidance. But narrowness also meant precision. The German transmitters had to be aimed with extraordinary care, and any slight misalignment would cause beams to miss their intended target intersection points. The signal strength was consistent, but not overwhelming. The receivers in German aircraft were sensitive, but not impossibly so. This meant that if the British could generate signals on the same frequency that were sufficiently strong, they could interfere with or even overpower the German beams. Jones formulated a multi-layered countermeasure strategy. The first layer was the simplest, jamming. British transmitters would broadcast noise on the same frequencies as the German beams. This wouldn't completely block the beams. The German signals would still be detectable, but it would make them harder to follow accurately. Pilots would hear static mixed with the beam tones, making it difficult to determine precise positioning. But Jones recognized that crude jamming had serious limitations. First, if the jamming was too obvious, the Germans would immediately know their system had been compromised and might switch to backup frequencies or different systems entirely. Second, effective jamming required knowing exactly which frequencies the Germans were using for each raid, and frequencies could be changed. Third, blanket jamming would disrupt all radio communications in the affected areas, including British communications. So Jones developed a more elegant approach, not destroying the beams, but corrupting them. Instead of broadcasting noise, British transmitters would broadcast false beam signals, carefully crafted to blend with the real German beams, but carrying misleading directional information. German pilots would still hear what seemed like proper beam tones, but those tones would guide them away from their targets rather than toward them. This technique, which Jones called meaconing, a portmanteau of masking beacon, was fiendishly clever. The British transmitters would listen to the German beams, then rebroadcast slightly modified versions. To a German pilot, it would seem like he was following the beam correctly, but in reality, he was following a British signal that was leading him astray. The beauty of this approach was its subtlety. German Bomber Command might think pilots were navigating poorly, or that atmospheric conditions were interfering with beams, but they wouldn't immediately realize that their beams were being deliberately manipulated. Implementing meaconing required technical sophistication. The British transmitters needed to receive the German beam signals, process them in real time, modify them subtly, and retransmit on the same frequency with sufficient power to compete with the German signal, all with minimal delay. This was cutting-edge radio engineering for 1940, requiring custom-built equipment that didn't exist in any standard form. Cockburn led the team developing the transmitters. They worked around the clock, designing circuits, winding transformer coils by hand, testing and retesting each component. Every part had to be reliable because failures in the field would mean German bombers reaching their targets unmolested, and everything had to be built with wartime resource constraints, shortages of components, limited machine shop capacity, competing demands from other military projects. Meanwhile, Jones had to solve the strategic problem of where to position the countermeasure transmitters. They needed to be close enough to German bombers to provide strong counter-signals, but not so close to likely targets that they'd be destroyed in raids. They needed reliable power supplies, a challenge in wartime Britain where electrical grids were frequently disrupted. They needed to be networked so they could be coordinated centrally, but communications infrastructure was limited. Jones pored over maps, calculating optimal positions based on beam patterns, likely bomber routes and geographical constraints. He consulted with RAF officers about which targets were most likely to be attacked. He worked with civil defense planners to identify locations where transmitters could be installed quickly and defended adequately. The final network design called for 21 transmitter stations, positioned across central and southern England. Each would be equipped with receivers to detect German beams and transmitters to broadcast counter-signals. A central control room would monitor German beam activity and coordinate the countermeasures, activating specific transmitters based on which beams were active and which targets appeared threatened. As January turned to February and February to March, the system took shape. Transmitters were installed in requisitioned buildings, camouflaged as innocuous structures to avoid attracting attention. Power lines were run, backup generators installed, communication lines were established, connecting each station to the central control room and to RAF intelligence. Operators were trained, learning to recognize German beam patterns and activate appropriate countermeasures. Throughout this frenetic preparation, Jones faced constant pressure. The military command wanted progress reports. Political leadership wanted assurances that countermeasures would work. Intelligence agencies wanted assessments of German capabilities. And underlying everything was the knowledge that German bombers could begin using nicobine for precision attacks at any moment. Every day without countermeasures was a day of vulnerability. The first operational test came on March 13, 1940. Intelligence had detected German preparations for a raid on Scapa Flow, a major British naval base in the Orkney Islands north of Scotland. Nicobine beams were detected aligning on the target. Jones authorized activation of the countermeasures. British meaconing transmitters began broadcasting false beam signals. The German bombers, following what they thought was their guidance system, were led off course. Most bombs fell into the sea, miles from Scapa Flow. A few aircraft, whose crews may have suspected something was wrong and reverted to dead reckoning navigation, came closer to the target but achieved no significant hits. The raid was reported by German Bomber Command as partially successful. Some crews claimed hits on naval vessels, but reconnaissance showed no damage to the base. From the British perspective, the countermeasures had worked, but the test had also revealed weaknesses. The false beam signals hadn't been strong enough in all cases. and some pilots had apparently detected that something was amiss. The system needed refinement. Jones's team iterated rapidly. They increased transmitter power. They refined the algorithms that generated false beam signals, making them more realistic. They improved coordination between transmitter stations so that counter-signals would reinforce each other rather than creating confusing interference patterns. They established protocols for monitoring effectiveness in real time and adjusting countermeasures during raids. By April 1940, the countermeasure network was maturing. Multiple raids had been disrupted, though the British could never be certain how much was due to their countermeasures and how much to German navigational errors or other factors. But the trend was clear. When countermeasures were active, bombing accuracy declined markedly. Then Jones discovered something that made his blood run cold. While monitoring German signals, his team detected references to a new system, X-Juret. Based on fragmentary intercepts and technical analysis, Jones realized that X-Juret was far more sophisticated than Nicobine. It used multiple beams in sequence, automated bombing equipment, speed calculations, a complete navigation and bombing system that removed human error from the equation. Worse, X-Juret operated on different frequencies than Nicobine, used different signal encoding, and was installed only in elite bomber units. The countermeasures Jones had built for Nicobine would be largely ineffective against X-Juret. He was facing a second invisible threat, and this one was even more dangerous than the first. Jones briefed military leadership on the new development. The reaction was frustration mixed with grudging admiration for German technical prowess. "They've built a backup system," Dowding observed. "They anticipated that we might find and counter Nicobine, so they developed something more sophisticated as insurance." "It's more than a backup," Jones corrected. X-Juret is their primary precision weapon. Nicobine is for general area bombing, good enough for hitting cities or large industrial zones. X-Juret is for destroying specific buildings, bridges, power stations, command centers. And it's operational. Intelligence indicates that Kampfgruppe 100, an elite Pathfinder unit, is equipped with X-Juret and has been training intensively. The implications sank in around the room. Kampfgruppe 100 would use X-Juret to mark targets with extreme precision, dropping incendiaries that would start fires. These fires would serve as visible markers for following waves of bombers equipped only with standard navigation equipment. The elite unit would find and mark the target. The mass bombers would destroy it. It was an elegant and terrifying tactic. Can you counter it? The question came from Air Vice Marshal William Sholto Douglas. Jones was silent for a moment, calculating. The principles are similar to Nicobine. We can jam or misdirect X-Juret, but the system is more complex. We'll need to detect the beams, analyze their characteristics, build new countermeasure equipment, and deploy it. And we'll have to do it before the Germans launch a major X-Juret guided attack. How long? Douglas pressed. 8 weeks, minimum. Jones saw the dismay on faces around the table. But we'll begin immediate preparations. We have the framework from the Nicobine countermeasures. We can adapt and expand, and we'll monitor German signals continuously to gather as much intelligence as possible before we have to engage. Once again, Jones was racing against time. But now he had more experience, a proven team, and infrastructure in place. The beam war was escalating, but the British were no longer fighting blind. Through the spring and summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain dominated public attention and historical record. RAF fighters battled German bombers in daylight skies over southern England in a desperate campaign that would determine whether Britain could resist invasion. But parallel to that visible battle, an invisible war was being fought in the radio spectrum, known only to a handful of scientists and military planners. Jones's team worked with intense focus to understand and counter X-Juret. The challenge was compounded by the fact that the system was used sparingly. German commanders were careful not to reveal its full capabilities until they were ready for decisive strikes. This meant Jones had limited opportunities to observe Exjuret in operation and gather data about its characteristics. Signals intelligence provided crucial insights. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were reading some German military communications, and messages from Kampfgruppe 100 occasionally contained technical details about Exjuret operations. Jones received regular briefings on these intercepts, piecing together how the system worked from fragmentary references to beam frequencies, crossing points, and bombing procedures. In June 1940, a significant breakthrough occurred. A German aircraft from Kampfgruppe 100, possibly disoriented by weather or battle damage, strayed off course over Britain and was shot down by a night fighter. The wreckage was recovered, and critically, portions of the Exjuret receiver equipment were intact. Jones personally examined the recovered equipment at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. The apparatus was ingeniously designed. Compact, robust, integrated elegantly into the aircraft's instrumentation. By studying its components, Jones's team could determine the exact frequencies Exjuret used, the sensitivity of the receivers, the nature of the signal encoding. This intelligence was invaluable. With the frequencies known, British monitoring stations could listen for Exjuret beams specifically. With the receiver sensitivity measured, engineers could calculate how powerful countermeasure transmitters needed to be to compete with or overpower the German signals. With the signal encoding understood, they could design false signals that would be interpreted as genuine by the German. Equipment development of Exjuret countermeasures followed the same principles as the Knickerbein campaign, but required more sophisticated equipment. The Exjuret beams were narrower, more stable, and carried more complex information. Not just directional guidance, but timing signals for the automated bombing system. British countermeasures needed to interfere with both guidance and timing aspects. Robert Cockburn designed a transmitter system that could detect Exjuret beams, analyze their timing patterns, and inject false timing signals. The goal was to confuse the automated bombing mechanism so it would drop bombs either too early or too late. If German aircraft crossed the Exjuret beams at the correct positions, but the timing signals were corrupted, bombs would fall hundreds of meters off target, despite the crew following procedures perfectly. This was psychological warfare at a technical level. The German crews would believe they had executed their mission flawlessly. They would report success, but the bombs would miss. German commanders would be baffled by the disconnect between perfect navigation and poor results. They might blame weather, might blame equipment malfunctions, might blame crew performance, but they wouldn't immediately suspect that their secure radio navigation system was being manipulated by an enemy who understood it better than they did. By August 1940, the Exjuret countermeasure network was operational. 80 modified transmitter stations were positioned across Britain, each equipped to detect and jam or misdirect both Knickerbein and Exjuret beams. A sophisticated control system allowed operators to monitor German beam activity in real time and activate appropriate countermeasures within minutes of detecting a beam. The Qaid first major test came on a night in late August when intelligence detected unusual Exjuret beam activity concentrating on Birmingham, a critical industrial center. The beams were aligned with unprecedented precision, suggesting a major raid was imminent. Jones authorized full countermeasure activation. That night, aircraft from Kampfgruppe 100 took off from occupied France, flying the complex mission profile required for Exjuret operations. They flew along the approach beam, crossed the preliminary warning beam, started their automated bombing clocks on the second crossing beam, stopped the clocks on the third beam. Everything proceeded according to their training. The equipment functioned perfectly. At the calculated moment, bombs were automatically released. But the British countermeasure transmitters had been injecting false timing signals throughout the approach. The German automated bombing equipment, receiving a mixture of genuine and false signals, calculated an incorrect release point. The incendiary bombs, intended to mark Birmingham's factories for following bomber waves, fell instead on open countryside several miles northwest of the city. The following wave of German bombers, hundreds of aircraft equipped with standard navigation equipment, looked for the fires that Kampfgruppe 100 should have started. They saw nothing in the expected location. Confused, lacking clear targets, they scattered their bombs across a wide area. Some hit Birmingham, but the attack was dispersed and far less effective than planned. German after-action reports from that night reflected confusion. Kampfgruppe 100 crews insisted they had followed procedures perfectly and marked the correct target. Yet, the main bombing force reported being unable to locate the markers. Someone was blamed for the failure. Possibly the Pathfinder crews, possibly the main force navigators, but the true cause remained invisible to German analysis. This pattern repeated over the following months. German bombers attempted precision attacks on British targets, guided by their sophisticated beam systems. British countermeasures systematically degraded the accuracy of these attacks. Bombs fell in fields, in the sea, in residential areas far from intended industrial targets. The attacks caused casualties and damage. No defensive system is perfect, but they failed to achieve their strategic objectives. The psychological impact on German bomber crews was significant. They had been told their guidance systems were revolutionary, that they could bomb with unprecedented accuracy. Yet night after night, missions returned with poor results, despite crews insisting they had followed procedures correctly. Confidence in the systems eroded. Some crews began reverting to traditional dead-reckoning navigation, which was even less accurate. But the invisible war was about to take another turn. German engineers, puzzled by the declining effectiveness of their beam systems, began investigating possible causes. Some suspected British jamming, though the evidence was ambiguous. In response, they developed another system. Wotan, also called Y-Juret, was fundamentally different from Knickebein and X-Juret. Instead of relying on multiple ground beams that aircraft flew through, Y-Juret used a single beam combined with a transponder. A ground station would transmit a beam, and the aircraft would carry a transponder that responded to interrogation signals. By measuring the time delay between sending a signal and receiving a response, the ground station could calculate the aircraft's distance along the beam with extraordinary precision. The genius of Y-Juret was that the primary intelligence was on the ground, not in the aircraft. The ground station calculated the aircraft's position and radioed instructions: fly straight, turn left, turn right, drop bombs. The pilot simply followed voice instructions, making the system resistant to the jamming and misdirection techniques that had compromised Knickebein and X-Juret. Jones learned of Y-Juret through signals intelligence in late 1940. The first references were cryptic, but as more intercepts accumulated, he realized the Germans had developed yet another navigation system, this one potentially immune to existing countermeasures. The challenge of countering Y-Juret was different and in some ways more difficult. British transmitters couldn't simply jam or redirect the beams as before. The two-way nature of the system meant that interference would be immediately obvious. If a German aircraft's transponder stopped responding correctly, ground controllers would know something was wrong. Jones conceived a counter-strategy that was audacious and complex. Instead of jamming Y-Juret, British stations would impersonate German aircraft. They would detect Y-Juret interrogation signals from German ground stations and respond with false transponder replies. To the German ground station, it would appear that there were multiple aircraft along the beam at various distances. The real aircraft's transponder signal would be mixed with false signals, making it difficult for German controllers to determine which was genuine. Additionally, if British stations could respond to interrogation signals with false range information, German ground controllers might give navigation instructions based on incorrect position data. A German bomber might be told, "Drop bombs now," when it was actually miles from the target. Developing this countermeasure required building equipment that could detect Y-Jet interrogation pulses, generate appropriate transponder response signals, and transmit them with precise timing. The physics of radio propagation meant that timing was critical. The delay between interrogation and response determined the calculated distance. British false responses needed to have realistic delays that suggested plausible aircraft. Positions. Dr. Cockburn and his team built what they called transponder simulators, ground-based systems that mimicked aircraft transponders, but could be programmed to report false positions. These were deployed at countermeasure stations across Britain. By early 1941, the effectiveness of Y-Jet countermeasures was harder to assess than previous systems because the British couldn't directly observe German ground station behavior. They could only infer effectiveness by monitoring German radio communications during raids and assessing bombing accuracy. But the evidence suggested success. Raids that appeared to rely on Y-Jet guidance achieved no better accuracy than those using compromised Nicobane or X-Jet systems. By mid-1941, the beam war had reached a stalemate. Germany had invested enormous resources in developing multiple sophisticated navigation systems. Britain had countered each one with remarkable speed and ingenuity. German bombers could still reach British targets. The countermeasures didn't prevent attacks, but their accuracy was degraded to the point that precision bombing was no longer possible. The strategic implications were profound. Germany's plan to systematically dismantle British industrial capacity through precision bombing had been thwarted. Britain's factories, power plants, and transportation networks remained operational enough to sustain the war effort. Civilian morale, though strained by bombing, didn't collapse as it might have under more concentrated and accurate attacks. Historians often focus on the Battle of Britain's daylight aerial combat as the decisive moment that prevented German invasion. But equally important was the Beam War, the invisible battle that prevented German bombers from accurately targeting Britain's strategic vulnerabilities. Without precision night bombing, Germany couldn't achieve the kind of systematic destruction that might have forced Britain to negotiate. Jones and his team had won a victory that few people knew about. The beam systems remained classified for years after the war. Even many military personnel involved in Britain's air defense were unaware of the full scope of the radio navigation battle. But in the highest circles of military planning, the significance was clear. Scientific intelligence and technical countermeasures had neutralized what should have been a decisive German advantage. Yet Jones knew that the invisible war was far from over. German engineers were persistent and creative. They would continue developing new systems, new technologies, new approaches. And beyond the immediate threat of beam-guided bombing, Jones was beginning to detect signs of something even more alarming: German research into long-range weapons that didn't require aircraft at all. While the beam war consumed much of Jones's attention through 1940 and early 1941, he maintained awareness of broader German technical developments. Intelligence reports crossed his desk, covering everything from aircraft performance to radio communications to industrial production. Most were routine, but Jones had trained himself to notice anomalies, pieces of information that didn't fit expected patterns, that suggested something unusual might be happening. In early 1941, several such anomalies caught his attention. An intelligence report mentioned that a German research facility on the Baltic coast, a place called Peenemünde, had been dramatically expanded with new construction and increased security. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed large buildings whose purpose wasn't immediately clear. Signals intelligence detected communications between Peenemünde and German military headquarters that used unfamiliar terminology. Individually, these data points might mean nothing. Military research facilities often expanded, built new structures, and used coded language. But Jones's instinct, honed through the beam investigations, told him that something significant might be developing at Peenemünde. He began compiling a file on the facility. Any intelligence reference to Peenemünde, no matter how tangential, was added. Reconnaissance photos were analyzed in detail. Intercepted communications were scrutinized for technical terms that might provide clues about the research being conducted. Over months, a picture emerged. Peenemünde wasn't just a research facility, it was a major development and testing center for advanced weapons. References in intercepted communications mentioned rockets and long-range bombardment and automatic guidance. Technical diagrams recovered from a captured German document showed what appeared to be a large missile. Jones presented his findings to military intelligence in June 1941. The reaction was mixed. Some officers were skeptical that Germany could develop functional long-range rockets. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. Others recognized that if the intelligence was accurate, Britain faced a new and potentially devastating threat. "What kind of weapon are we talking about?" asked an Air Ministry official. Jones laid out what he had pieced together. Based on the available intelligence, the Germans appeared to be developing a ballistic missile. Not a small battlefield rocket, but a weapon capable of carrying a substantial warhead, perhaps a ton of explosives, over distances of hundreds of miles. It would be launched from sites in occupied Europe and strike targets in Britain. Unlike an aircraft, it can't be intercepted by fighters or shot down by anti-aircraft guns. It follows a ballistic trajectory, straight up, then down. By the time you detect it, it's seconds from impact. The room was silent as the implications sank in. How accurate would such a weapon be? Someone asked. Unknown, Jones admitted. Guidance technology for ballistic missiles is extraordinarily complex. They might have accuracy measured in miles, in which case the weapon would be useful only against large targets like cities. Or they might have more sophisticated guidance, allowing precision strikes. We don't have enough information to assess. And do you believe this weapon is real? That it's actually in development? Jones paused, considering how to answer. The scientist in him wanted more evidence, more data. But his experience with the beam systems had taught him that Germany was capable of remarkable technical achievements. "I believe it's real," he said finally. "And I believe that if we wait for definitive proof, we'll get it when one of these rockets lands in London." The decision was made to prioritize intelligence gathering on Peenemünde. Reconnaissance flights were increased. Signals intelligence focused on communications associated with the facility. Agents in occupied Europe were tasked with gathering information about large rockets or missiles. In July 1943, aerial reconnaissance captured images that confirmed Jones's worst suspicions. Photographs showed large torpedo-shaped objects on test stands at Peenemünde. The objects were clearly rockets, and their size suggested they could carry significant payloads over long distances. Further analysis revealed what appeared to be launch infrastructure: platforms, fueling systems, control bunkers. The intelligence was immediately escalated to the highest levels of British government. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was briefed personally by Jones, who explained that Germany had developed a weapon that could strike British cities without warning and without any realistic means of interception. Churchill made a characteristically bold decision: destroy Peenemünde. If the facility could be eliminated or significantly damaged, the rocket program would be delayed or possibly ended. The cost of such a raid would be high. Peenemünde was heavily defended and located far from Britain, but the alternative was accepting bombardment by weapons that couldn't be stopped. Operation Hydra was planned as a massive bombing raid targeting Peenemünde. Over 600 RAF bombers would attack in a single night, attempting to destroy workshops, assembly facilities, research buildings, and kill or disperse the scientific and engineering personnel. The raid was scheduled for August 17-18, 1943, when moon conditions would aid navigation, but also expose bombers to anti-aircraft fire. Jones had mixed feelings about the operation. As a scientist, he found the idea of deliberately targeting fellow scientists and engineers abhorrent. Many of the people working at Peenemünde were likely brilliant researchers who might have contributed to peacetime progress in rocketry and space exploration. But, as a military intelligence officer, He understood that war created impossible moral dilemmas. If the raid saved thousands of British lives by preventing rocket attacks, could it be justified? There was no satisfying answer. The raid proceeded as planned. 596 bombers took off from airfields across Britain and flew through the night to the Baltic coast. German defenses were formidable, and the raid was costly. 40 British bombers were shot down, with hundreds of crew killed or captured. But the attack achieved significant damage. Workshops were destroyed, assembly buildings burned, research facilities were damaged, and, critically, a number of key scientists and engineers were killed, including Dr. Walter Thiel, the chief rocket propulsion expert. The raid set back the German rocket program by months, possibly longer. Production of the V-2 rocket, as it would be known, was delayed and eventually had to be dispersed to underground facilities, further complicating manufacturing. When V-2 attacks on Britain finally began in September 1944, they came later and in smaller numbers than German planners had originally envisioned. But Jones's investigation of Peenemünde revealed something that wouldn't become fully apparent until after the war. The facility had been involved not just in rocket development, but in broader advanced weapons research, including connections to Germany's nuclear program. Documents recovered after the war showed that scientists at Peenemünde had coordinated with nuclear researchers elsewhere in Germany, and that long-term plans had envisioned rocket delivery of nuclear warheads. The full scope of what Jones had helped to disrupt wasn't clear to him during the war. He knew he had identified a major weapons program and contributed to its disruption. But only later did the implications become truly apparent. By exposing the Peenemünde program, when he did, Jones had potentially prevented Germany from developing not just long-range conventional rockets, but nuclear-armed missiles. Had the Peenemünde program continued undisrupted for another year or two, and had German nuclear research progressed further, the consequences might have been catastrophic. While pursuing the beam systems and the Peenemünde threats, Jones made another discovery that would prove crucial to Allied victory: the nature and limitations of German radar technology. This discovery emerged almost accidentally from his investigations into beam navigation, but would have implications far beyond the immediate battle for Britain's skies. In late 1941, while analyzing captured German radio equipment, Jones noticed that some components seemed over-engineered for simple navigation systems. Amplifiers were more sensitive than necessary. Antennas had characteristics that suggested they were designed for detecting weak reflected signals rather than just receiving direct transmissions. These observations led Jones to investigate German radar development. Radar, radio detection and ranging, was technology both Britain and Germany had developed independently before the war. The principle was simple: transmit a radio pulse, detect the echo that bounces back from distant objects, and calculate the distance based on the time delay between transmission and reception. Britain's chain-home radar network had been crucial during the Battle of Britain, providing early warning of German bomber formations and allowing efficient deployment of fighter defenses. But Jones realized that understanding German radar capabilities was strategically important in multiple ways. If German aircraft had airborne radar, they could detect British aircraft at night, making RAF bombing campaigns more dangerous. If German ships had radar, they could detect British naval vessels at longer ranges. If German air defenses had sophisticated radar, they could direct anti-aircraft fire more accurately. Through careful analysis of captured equipment, interrogation of prisoners, and signals intelligence, Jones pieced together a comprehensive picture of German radar technology. What he discovered was both reassuring and concerning. German radar was effective but had limitations. Their systems generally operated at longer wavelengths than British equivalents, which meant lower resolution. German radar could detect that something was present, but had difficulty determining precisely what or where. This was partly a technological choice and partly a result of Germany's research trajectory having gone down a slightly different path than Britain's. More importantly, Jones discovered that German radar systems were vulnerable to jamming and deception. By understanding the frequencies and characteristics of German radar, British forces could develop electronic countermeasures to blind or confuse them. This became critical as the war progressed and the Allies began large-scale bombing campaigns over Europe. Jones worked with RAF electronic warfare specialists to develop window, strips of metal foil that, when dropped from aircraft, created false radar returns. A bomber-dropping window would appear on German radar as dozens or hundreds of targets, overwhelming operators and making it impossible to distinguish real aircraft from chaff. The first use of window during a raid on Hamburg in July 1943 proved devastatingly effective. German air defenses were paralyzed, unable to coordinate fighter intercepts or anti-aircraft fire effectively. But Jones's radar investigations also revealed German strengths. Germany had developed sophisticated radar systems for submarines, allowing U-boats to detect Allied ships and aircraft at considerable distances. This made convoy protection more difficult and contributed to heavy Allied shipping losses in the Atlantic. Understanding these systems allowed British scientists to develop countermeasures. Aircraft hunting U-boats were equipped with radar warning receivers that could detect when a submarine's radar was active, allowing them to locate and attack U-boats that thought they were safely detecting threats at a distance. Later in the war, Allied forces developed increasingly sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities based on understanding German radar technology. The radar investigations exemplified Jones's broader approach to scientific intelligence. Understand the enemy's technology comprehensively, identify both capabilities and vulnerabilities, and develop countermeasures that exploit weaknesses while negating strengths. This approach had worked for beam systems, for Peenemünde, and now for radar. It would become a model for intelligence operations in subsequent conflicts. No account of Jones's wartime work can avoid discussing one of the most controversial and painful episodes of the Beam War, the bombing of Coventry on EVT, November 14, 1940. This raid exemplified the agonizing moral and strategic dilemmas that scientific intelligence created, where knowledge of enemy plans forced impossible choices about how to act on that knowledge. By November 1940, British countermeasures against German beam systems were operational, but not yet fully mature. Jones's team could detect beams, could jam them to some extent, could sometimes misdirect them. But the systems weren't perfect. Sometimes countermeasures failed. Sometimes the Germans adjusted frequencies or techniques faster than British responses could adapt. And always, there was the strategic concern about revealing too much about British capabilities. On November 11th, signals intelligence detected an unusual increase in German communications related to beam systems. Nicobine and X-Jurate beams were being aligned with extraordinary care on targets in the Midlands. The code name for the operation was Intercepted. Moonlight Sonata. The scale of preparation suggested a major raid, possibly the largest yet attempted with beam guidance. By November 12th, Jones's team had determined with high confidence that the target was Coventry, an industrial city with critical aircraft factories, engine plants, and munitions works. The beam intersections pointed unambiguously at the city's center and surrounding industrial areas. Intelligence indicated that over 400 bombers would participate, guided by Pathfinder aircraft using X-Jurate to mark targets with incendiaries. This created an excruciating dilemma for British military and political leadership. They knew the target, knew approximately when the raid would occur, and knew it would be devastating. But responding to this knowledge was complicated by multiple competing concerns. First, if Britain evacuated Coventry or dramatically increased its defenses, German intelligence might deduce that their beam systems had been compromised. This could prompt them to change frequencies, develop new systems, or abandon beam navigation entirely in favor of methods that Britain might not be able to counter. The intelligence advantage that Jones had worked so hard to establish could be lost. Second, British defensive resources were limited. Concentrating fighters and anti-aircraft guns at Coventry would leave other cities vulnerable. If the German raid was actually a feint, or if they changed targets at the last moment, British forces would be badly positioned. Third, and most cynically, there was a calculation about the value of maintaining intelligence capabilities versus the cost of a single raid. If keeping German confidence in their beam systems meant allowing this raid to proceed with limited interference, but subsequently being able to disrupt dozens of future raids, was that a defensible trade-off? These decisions were made at the highest levels of British government and military command. Jones participated in discussions but ultimately didn't control the final choices. His role was to provide technical advice about what countermeasures were possible and what the consequences of various actions might be. The decision that emerged was a compromise that satisfied no one morally but seemed strategically sound. British countermeasures would be activated but not at maximum capacity. Some beam jamming would occur, enough to degrade German accuracy somewhat, but not enough to make it obvious that beams were being systematically countered. Coventry authorities would be warned that a raid was likely, allowing some preparation, but no mass evacuation would be ordered. RAF fighters and anti-aircraft guns would be alerted but not concentrated to an extent that would signal foreknowledge. The raid occurred on the night of November 14, 1940. It was as devastating as intelligence had predicted. Over 500 German bombers attacked Coventry in waves, guided by ex-Jarette-equipped pathfinders that marked targets with exceptional accuracy despite British jamming. The city burned. The medieval cathedral, standing since the 14th century, was destroyed. Hundreds of civilians died. Thousands were injured. Vast swaths of the city center were reduced to rubble. British countermeasures did have some effect. Post-raid analysis suggested that without jamming, casualties and damage would have been significantly higher. Some bombs fell outside intended target areas because of beam disruption, but the overall effect was still catastrophic. Jones listened to reports throughout the night from his office in London, each update a knife twist. He knew intellectually that the decisions made had been strategic, that they balanced immediate costs against long-term advantages, that they preserved capabilities that would save more lives in the future. But the intellectual justification didn't ease the emotional weight of knowing that people were dying, in part because of calculations about intelligence value. In the aftermath, Jones personally visited Coventry to document bombing patterns and assess countermeasure effectiveness. Walking through the destroyed streets, seeing the rubble that had been homes and businesses, talking to survivors who had lost everything, was profoundly affecting. One moment stayed with him for the rest of his life. An elderly woman, sorting through debris that had been her home, looked up at Jones and his team with their notebooks and technical equipment and asked simply, "Will this help?" Jones struggled to answer, managing only, "We're trying to make sure it doesn't happen again." That encounter crystallized for Jones the human stakes of the invisible war he was fighting. It wasn't an abstract game of technical one-upmanship. Every decision had consequences measured in lives. Every successful countermeasure saved families. Every failure left ruins. The Coventry raid did serve one strategic purpose, though the cost was terrible. German Bomber Command was satisfied that their beam systems had worked well. They believed the raid's success validated their navigation technology. This confidence meant they continued relying on beam guidance for subsequent raids, which allowed British countermeasures to remain effective. Over the following months, many raids were disrupted by increasingly sophisticated jamming and misdirection, preventing repetitions of Coventry's devastation in other cities. But the moral weight of that decision, to allow Coventry to be bombed while preserving intelligence capabilities, remained controversial. After the war, when details of the beam war were declassified, debates erupted about whether the choice had been justified. Some argued that even imperfect countermeasures should have been used at maximum capacity to minimize casualties, regardless of strategic concerns about revealing capabilities. Others maintained that the long-term intelligence Advantages gained by maintaining partial secrecy saved more lives than maximum. Intervention at Coventry would have, Jones himself never fully, resolved this dilemma in his own mind. In his later writings, he acknowledged the terrible calculus involved and expressed uncertainty about whether the right choices had been made. What he was certain of was that scientific intelligence created moral dilemmas that previous generations of warriors had never faced. Knowing what the enemy planned, where they would strike, when the attack would come, this knowledge brought not just advantage but agonizing responsibility for how that knowledge was used. Jones's work on beam systems and Peenemünde represented something larger than just tactical victories in specific technical battles. He was pioneering an entirely new field, scientific and technical intelligence. Before Jones, intelligence agencies focused primarily on human intelligence. Spies, informants, defectors, and signals intelligence intercepted communications and code breaking. Technical capabilities were assessed, but usually through direct observation or capture of equipment after the fact. Jones demonstrated that you could deduce enemy technical capabilities through careful analysis of fragmentary evidence, that you could predict what technologies an enemy might develop based on understanding their research directions, and that you could develop countermeasures before enemy systems even became fully operational. This proactive approach to technical intelligence was revolutionary. The impact extended beyond the immediate wartime applications. Jones's methods became the foundation for Cold War intelligence efforts. During decades of U.S.-Soviet competition, both sides employed scientific intelligence specialists who analyzed enemy technical developments in exactly the ways Jones had pioneered. The ability to detect Soviet missile tests from distant sensor readings, to assess the performance of Soviet aircraft from radar observations, to deduce the characteristics of Soviet submarines from acoustic signatures, all of these descended directly from techniques Jones developed during the Beam War. Moreover, Jones showed that small teams of creative scientists could achieve results disproportionate to their resources. His Beam countermeasure team never numbered more than a few dozen people at its core, yet they neutralized systems that Germany had invested millions of Reichsmarks and thousands of man-hours to develop. This demonstrated that in modern warfare, intelligence and innovation could be force multipliers as powerful as additional divisions or fleets. Jones also established principles for scientific intelligence that remain relevant in contemporary contexts. First, never assume the impossible. When evidence points to enemy capabilities that seem technically infeasible, investigate thoroughly before dismissing the evidence. Germany's beam system seemed impossible to many British officers initially, but they were real. Second, understand enemy technology systemically. It's not enough to know that a capability exists. You must understand how it works, what its limitations are, and how it fits into broader enemy strategy. Third, develop countermeasures creatively. Direct confrontation isn't always the best approach. Sometimes subtlety, deception, and misdirection are more effective. These principles extended beyond military applications. Jones's approach influenced how intelligence agencies assessed nuclear proliferation threats, how they monitored technological developments in adversary nations, and how they predicted future military capabilities based on research trends. The fundamental method: collect fragmentary evidence, synthesize it into comprehensive understanding, predict future developments, develop countermeasures, became standard practice. But Jones's legacy isn't just methodological. It's also a reminder that science is never neutral in wartime. Scientists during World War II found themselves deeply embedded in military operations, and their choices had profound consequences. The atomic bomb is the most famous example, but Jones's work illustrates the same dynamic at a smaller scale. His technical analyses directly influenced military operations and strategic decisions. His countermeasures saved lives, but also contributed to the overall destructive machinery of war. His intelligence work against Peenemünde led to a bombing raid that killed civilian scientists and engineers. Jones grappled with these ethical dimensions throughout his career. He never believed that science should be divorced from moral considerations, or that technical cleverness justified any application. Yet he also believed that when civilization itself was threatened, as it was by Nazi Germany, scientists had obligations to apply their skills in defense of freedom and human dignity. The tension between these beliefs was never fully resolved, perhaps because it's fundamentally unresolvable. As the war progressed beyond 1941, the immediate threat of German beam-guided bombing gradually diminished. This wasn't because Germany abandoned the technology, but because the strategic situation changed. British night defenses improved with better radar, more effective fighter tactics, and increasingly sophisticated ground-controlled intercept systems. German bomber losses increased to unsustainable levels. Germany's strategic focus shifted eastward to the Soviet Union, drawing resources away from the air campaign against Britain. And British countermeasures had become so effective that beam guidance provided diminishing advantages. But Jones's work continued and evolved. As the Allies transitioned from defense to offense, with large-scale bombing campaigns over Germany, the principles Jones had developed for countering German systems were applied to protecting Allied bombers. RAF Bomber Command and later the U.S. 8th Air Force faced sophisticated German air defenses, radar-guided fighters, radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery, searchlights, and communications networks that coordinated defensive responses. Jones worked with RAF electronic warfare specialists to develop countermeasures against these German defenses. This included window for radar confusion, as mentioned earlier, but also more sophisticated techniques. British bombers were equipped with receivers that could detect German radar emissions, providing warning when fighters were approaching or when anti-aircraft batteries were tracking them. Specialized aircraft flew with bomber formations specifically to jam German radars and communications, creating electronic fog that prevented coordinated defenses. The techniques were remarkably similar to what Germany had attempted with their beam systems, just inverted. Instead of guiding friendly aircraft, the goal was to blind enemy defenses, and the outcomes were similarly significant. When electronic warfare capabilities were employed effectively, bomber losses decreased markedly. When they failed or were unavailable, losses spiked. Jones also contributed to intelligence assessments of German technical developments in other areas. He analyzed reports about German jet aircraft, the Me-262 and He-162, and assessed their potential impact on air superiority. He investigated German developments in guided anti-shipping weapons, including radio-controlled glide bombs that were used with some success against Allied naval vessels in the Mediterranean. Each investigation followed the same pattern: collect fragmentary intelligence, synthesize into comprehensive understanding, predict capabilities and limitations, recommend countermeasures. By 1944, as Allied victory became increasingly certain, Jones's role shifted toward planning for post-war challenges. The emerging threat wasn't Germany, but the Soviet Union, and the techniques Jones had developed for understanding German technology would be needed to assess Soviet capabilities. But that would be a different war, a cold one, fought with espionage and technical intelligence rather than bombers and armies. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. Jones was 33 years old and had spent nearly 6 years in the invisible war against German technical capabilities. The beam systems he had countered were defunct. The Peenemünde facility he had helped to disrupt was captured by Soviet forces, who would use the technology and personnel they found there to jumpstart their own rocket and space programs. The broader electronic warfare techniques Jones had pioneered would continue evolving through the Cold War and into the present era. In the years immediately following the war, Jones's story remained classified. The techniques he had developed were too valuable to reveal publicly, and the Cold War meant that electronic warfare capabilities needed to be protected from Soviet intelligence. Jones returned to academic life, accepting a professorship at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, where he would spend the next 3 decades teaching and conducting research. But gradually, through the 1950s and 1960s, details of the Beam War began to emerge. Official histories were published. Memoirs from wartime leaders referenced the electronic warfare campaigns. Jones himself wrote about his experiences, first in classified reports for intelligence agencies and eventually in public writings. In 1978, Jones published Most Secret War, a memoir of his intelligence work during World War II. The book was revelatory. For the first time, the general public learned about the beam systems, about the battle to counter them, about the Peenemünde investigation, about the intricate technological and intelligence campaigns that had been waged invisibly while conventional battles dominated public attention. The book's impact extended beyond popular interest. It became required reading for intelligence professionals and military strategists. Jones's account provided insights into how scientific intelligence should be conducted, how technical threats should be assessed, and how small teams of creative thinkers could achieve strategic impact. Intelligence agencies in multiple countries used the book as a training tool, with Jones's methods becoming instructional examples. Jones received numerous honors for his wartime contributions. He was made a Companion of the Order of the Bath for his military intelligence work. He received the U.S. Medal of Freedom, recognizing his contributions to Allied victory. Multiple universities awarded him honorary degrees, but perhaps the recognition that meant most to Jones came from former adversaries. After the war, Jones met some of the German scientists who had developed the beam systems. These encounters were complex, respectful recognition of technical achievement, mixed with the knowledge that their innovations had been intended to cause destruction. One particularly poignant meeting was with Professor Hans Plendl, one of the original developers of nicobine. The two men discussed the technical details of the systems and countermeasures, each gaining appreciation for what the other had accomplished. Plendl admitted that German engineers had never fully understood why their beam systems became increasingly unreliable as the war progressed. They had suspected British interference, but hadn't grasped the sophistication of the countermeasures. "We thought our systems were unbreakable," Plendl said. "We didn't imagine that one man in London could understand them better than the teams who built them." Jones's post-war academic career was distinguished, but deliberately separated from his intelligence work. He taught physics, supervised graduate students, and conducted research in instrumentation and measurement. He avoided publicity and rarely discussed his wartime experiences except when writing his memoirs or when approached by historians researching the period, but his influence on intelligence and military strategy continued, indirectly through the people he had trained and the methods he had established. Many of Jones's wartime colleagues went on to significant careers in defense research and intelligence. The organizational structures he had pioneered, teams of scientists embedded in intelligence agencies, systematic technical analysis of enemy capabilities, rapid development of countermeasures became standard practice. The Beam War also influenced technological development in unexpected ways. The techniques for creating narrow radio beams, for detecting weak signals, for processing information in real time, for coordinating distributed networks, all of these had applications beyond military contexts. Post-war developments in telecommunications, radar systems, and eventually space technology built on foundations that included wartime electronic warfare research. Jones lived to see the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era of electronic warfare. In the 1991 Gulf War, Allied forces used sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities to blind Iraqi air defenses, allowing air campaigns to proceed with minimal losses. Jones recognized in these operations the direct descendants of techniques he had pioneered 50 years earlier. The specific technologies had advanced enormously: computer processing, satellite communications, precision-guided weapons, but the fundamental principles remained. Understand enemy systems, develop countermeasures, Use electronic warfare to create tactical and strategic advantages. In interviews late in his life, Jones was asked whether he felt his work had been worth the moral costs. He gave characteristically thoughtful answers. "We were fighting an existential threat," he would say. "Nazi Germany represented evil on a scale that demanded response. My work contributed to defeating that evil, and I'm proud of that. But I've never been comfortable with celebrating war, even when it's necessary. The Beam War saved lives, but it was still part of a larger conflict that destroyed millions of lives. There's no clean moral accounting in war." Asked about the Coventry decision specifically, Jones remained conflicted. "I can defend the strategic logic. Preserving intelligence capabilities likely saved more lives than maximum intervention at Coventry would have. But that doesn't erase the guilt of knowing we could have done more to protect those people. I've thought about that raid for 60 years, and I still don't have a satisfying answer." Perhaps there isn't one. Jones died in 1997 at the age of 86. His obituaries in major newspapers called him one of World War II's unsung heroes, and the scientist who saved Britain. These tributes weren't hyperbole, while Jones himself would have demurred at such praise. Pointing to the contributions of his team and the broader efforts of countless others, his role had indeed been crucial. Consider a counterfactual. What if Jones had not been recruited to air intelligence? What if the German beam systems had remained undetected until they were used operationally? What if British countermeasures had never been developed? German bombers would have been able to strike British targets with precision throughout 1940 and 1941. Industrial facilities, power plants, ports, airfields, all the infrastructure supporting Britain's war effort would have been systematically destroyed. Civilian casualties would have been far higher, potentially breaking morale and creating political pressure to negotiate. The RAF, unable to protect strategic targets effectively, might have been degraded to the point where air superiority was lost. The Battle of Britain, narrowly won in the real timeline, might have gone the other way. And beyond the immediate military consequences, failure to counter the beam systems would have meant no investigation of Peenemünde, no disruption of the V-weapon programs, no intelligence about German rocket and potentially nuclear research. The long-term implications could have been catastrophic. So while Jones was modest about his contributions, the evidence supports the conclusion that his work was indeed war-changing. Not in the dramatic way of major battles, but in the quieter, more subtle way of preventing disasters that never happened, of victories that were won before battles were even fought. The story of Jones and the Beam War resonates powerfully in the modern era, where invisible electronic warfare is more pervasive than ever. Today's military conflicts involve sophisticated electronic warfare systems that would astound World War II scientists. GPS jamming, cyber attacks, drone warfare, signals intelligence, radar stealth. All of these represent the evolution of the invisible war that Jones fought. But the fundamental principles remain constant. Modern electronic warfare specialists still work to understand adversary technologies, to develop countermeasures, to exploit weaknesses while protecting friendly capabilities. The methods have become vastly more complex, involving computer processing, artificial intelligence, space-based systems, but the intellectual approach descends directly from Jones's pioneering work. Modern intelligence agencies face challenges Jones would find familiar. How do you detect and assess technical capabilities that adversaries are trying to conceal? How do you predict future developments based on fragmentary evidence? How do you develop countermeasures against systems you haven't directly observed? These are exactly the problems Jones grappled with in 1940, just with different technologies involved. The ethical dilemmas are also remarkably similar. Modern intelligence capabilities, cyber warfare, for instance, create the same uncomfortable power that beam warfare countermeasures gave Jones, the ability to disrupt or manipulate adversary systems in ways that have strategic consequences. And with that power comes responsibility for difficult decisions about when and how to use such capabilities. Consider modern debates about cyber warfare. If a nation discovers vulnerabilities in an adversary's critical infrastructure, power grids, financial systems, communications networks, should those vulnerabilities be exploited preemptively? Should they be revealed to the adversary to prevent conflict escalation? Should they be held in reserve for use only in extremis? These questions parallel the decisions British leadership faced about how aggressively to counter German beam systems and how much to reveal about British capabilities. The Coventry dilemma, whether to act on intelligence in ways that might compromise intelligence sources and methods, remains relevant. Modern intelligence agencies regularly face situations where acting on information might reveal how that information was obtained, potentially closing off future intelligence channels. The calculus is never simple, and there are rarely clean answers. Jones's emphasis on understanding enemy technology comprehensively also remains crucial. In modern contexts, this means not just knowing that an adversary has a particular weapon system, but understanding its performance characteristics, limitations, operational doctrine, and integration with broader military capabilities. It means predicting how systems might be used, what countermeasures might be effective, and what second-order effects might emerge from actions taken. The modern proliferation of electronic warfare capabilities to non-state actors adds complexity Jones didn't face. During World War II, sophisticated radio navigation and electronic warfare systems required substantial resources and expertise, limiting them to major military powers. Today, relatively inexpensive commercial technology can be adapted for electronic warfare purposes, meaning that insurgent groups, terrorist organizations, and even individuals can potentially disrupt communications, jam signals, or conduct cyber attacks. This democratization of technology creates intelligence challenges that Jones's methods address only partially. When potential adversaries number in the thousands rather than a handful of nation-states, systematic technical intelligence becomes exponentially more difficult. Priorities must be set about which threats to investigate deeply and which to monitor at a lower level. Resources are always limited, and choices about where to focus inevitably mean other threats receive less attention. Yet despite these complications, Jones's core insights remain valuable. The importance of creative thinking and willingness to consider unlikely possibilities. The power of synthesizing fragmentary evidence into comprehensive understanding. The advantage of proactive intelligence that predicts threats before they materialize. The effectiveness of subtlety and deception compared to brute force. These principles transcend specific technologies and remain relevant regardless of how sophisticated systems become. Educational institutions and military training programs now teach case studies based on Jones's work. The beam war is used to illustrate principles of scientific intelligence, technical analysis, countermeasure development, and intelligence-informed strategy. Jones's memoir, Most Secret War, is assigned reading in courses on intelligence studies, military history, and strategic studies. But beyond professional military and intelligence contexts, Jones's story offers broader lessons. It demonstrates how individuals with specialized knowledge can have outsized impact during times of crisis. It shows that innovative thinking can overcome resource disadvantages. It illustrates the power of persistence in the face of skepticism. And it reminds us that many of history's most consequential battles aren't fought on visible battlefields, but in invisible spaces, technological, intellectual, informational, where small advantages can cascade into strategic victory. While much of Jones's wartime work has been documented and declassified, certain dimensions of his contributions remain less well known or understood. These aspects reveal additional layers of the invisible war and Jones's role in it. One such dimension involves the coordination between British scientific intelligence and Allied partners, particularly American counterparts, after the United States entered the war in December 1941. Jones worked closely with U.S. military intelligence and scientific advisors, sharing information about German technical capabilities and coordinating countermeasure development. This collaboration wasn't always smooth. American and British scientific communities had different approaches and priorities. American intelligence sometimes suspected that British colleagues were withholding information or exaggerating their own capabilities to maintain prestige. British scientists sometimes viewed American counterparts as overconfident and insufficiently rigorous. Jones worked to bridge these gaps, recognizing that Allied victory required pooling knowledge and resources. One significant joint project involved developing airborne electronic warfare systems for American heavy bombers that would begin operating over Europe in 1943. American B-17 and B-24 bombers faced German defenses during daylight raids, while RAF bombers faced them at night. The defensive technologies were similar, but optimized for different scenarios. Jones helped American specialists understand German radar systems and develop appropriate countermeasures, while American engineers contributed manufacturing capability and resources that British industry couldn't match given wartime constraints. Another lesser-known aspect involves Jones's role in deception operations. Beyond directly countering German technical systems, British intelligence conducted elaborate deception campaigns designed to mislead German commanders about Allied capabilities and intentions. Jones contributed technical elements to these deceptions. For example, before the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944, Allied planners wanted to deceive Germans about the invasion's location and timing. Part of this deception involved simulating large military formations in locations far from the actual landing sites. Jones helped develop electronic deception techniques that created false radar signatures, making it appear that large fleets of ships and aircraft were assembling in areas where no significant forces actually existed. These deceptions contributed to German confusion and misallocation of defensive resources during the crucial initial phases of the invasion. Jones also investigated German efforts to conduct their own scientific intelligence against British capabilities. German intelligence had eventually realized that their beam systems were being countered, and they attempted to determine how British countermeasures worked. German aircraft occasionally flew reconnaissance missions specifically to detect British jamming transmitters or to assess countermeasure effectiveness. Jones had to consider not just how to counter German systems, but how to do so in ways that didn't reveal too much about British techniques. This created a complex game of move and counter-move. British countermeasures had to be effective but also somewhat opaque. If German intelligence could fully understand how countermeasures worked, they could develop countermeasures. So British systems were designed with deceptive elements, features that would mislead German analysis about their operating principles. Jones also dealt with technical intelligence about German efforts in areas beyond navigation and radar. He investigated German acoustic torpedo technology, which used microphones to detect ship propeller sounds and guide torpedoes toward targets. He analyzed German infrared detection systems that could spot aircraft by the heat signature of their engines. He assessed German developments in radio-controlled weapons, including early precision-guided munitions. Each investigation followed similar patterns, but required different expertise and analytical approaches. Jones couldn't personally be expert in every technical domain, so he assembled networks of specialists who could provide detailed knowledge. His role evolved from personally conducting all analysis to orchestrating collaborative efforts among dozens of experts, synthesizing their findings into comprehensive intelligence assessments. This organizational innovation, creating integrated technical intelligence teams that combined multiple specialties, was as significant as Jones's specific analytical achievements. Before Jones, technical intelligence was fragmented across different agencies and specialties with limited coordination. Jones demonstrated the value of bringing diverse expertise together in structured ways that allowed comprehensive assessment of complex technical threats. Another dimension involves Jones's work after the immediate threat to Britain had passed. From 1942 onward, as British defenses strengthened and German bombing campaigns diminished, Jones's focus shifted toward supporting Allied offensive operations. This included intelligence assessments to support strategic bombing target selection, analysis of German industrial capacity and resilience, and prediction of how German capabilities might evolve in response to Allied pressure. Jones contributed to debates about bombing strategy, particularly regarding whether resources should focus on area bombing of cities versus precision attacks on specific industrial targets. He provided technical analysis suggesting that certain industries, ball-bearing production, synthetic fuel plants, aircraft engine factories, represented critical bottlenecks in German war production. Destroying these facilities would have disproportionate impact compared to general industrial damage. These assessments influenced Allied bombing priorities, though other factors, political considerations, operational constraints, competing strategic theories, also shaped decisions. Not all of Jones's recommendations were followed, and post-war analysis revealed that some of his assessments had been overly optimistic about the impact of targeting specific industries. German industrial capacity proved more resilient and adaptable than Allied intelligence had estimated. But the analytical approach, identifying critical nodes in complex systems and predicting consequences of disrupting them, was sound even when specific conclusions proved partially incorrect. Behind the technical achievements and strategic successes was a human being who paid personal costs for his wartime service. Jones rarely discussed these aspects publicly, maintaining professional demeanor and focusing on factual recounting of events. But those who knew him well understood that the war had taken emotional and psychological tolls. The stress of the work was enormous. For years, Jones operated knowing that his assessments and recommendations had life or death consequences. He worked brutal hours, 16, 18, sometimes 20-hour days, under constant deadline pressure. When intelligence indicated an imminent raid, there was no time for rest until countermeasures were prepared and activated. When new German capabilities were detected, they had to be analyzed immediately to assess threat levels and develop responses. Jones's physical health suffered. He lost weight, developed stress-related ailments, and slept poorly even on the rare occasions when time was available for rest. Photos of Jones from early in the war show a young man with a somewhat soft academic appearance. Photos from 1944 show someone who looks a decade older. Gaunt, intense, marked by strain. Relationships were strained. Jones married Vera Kane in 1940, shortly after beginning his intelligence work. The demands of his position meant he was frequently absent or distracted even when physically present. Conversations were limited by classification restrictions. There were vast areas of his life he simply couldn't discuss, even with his spouse. The couple had children during the war, and Jones later expressed regret about how little he had been present during their early years. The emotional weight of responsibility was perhaps the greatest burden. Jones was acutely aware that his successes prevented disasters while his failures allowed them. The Coventry raid haunted him precisely because it represented both success and failure simultaneously. Success in preserving intelligence capabilities, failure to prevent massive casualties. Similar dilemmas occurred throughout the war, though usually on smaller scales and with less dramatic consequences. Jones also bore the burden of knowledge about things he couldn't act on or couldn't fully investigate. Intelligence work involves constant triage, deciding which leads to pursue deeply and which to set aside due to resource limitations. Every choice to investigate one threat meant not investigating others. Sometimes Jones would later learn that a deprioritized investigation had involved real threats that subsequently caused damage. These revelations brought guilt, even though, rationally, he understood that perfect foresight was impossible, and that more threats always existed than could be addressed with available resources. The secretive nature of his work meant that Jones couldn't share the burdens or seek support from anyone outside a small circle of cleared colleagues. Most people he encountered daily had no idea what he did or why he seemed perpetually stressed. After the war, when he returned to academic life, the transition was jarring. Suddenly, he was teaching physics to undergraduates and dealing with university politics rather than countering existential threats. The shift in stakes and intensity was disorienting. Jones also struggled with what we might now recognize as moral injury, the psychological distress that comes from perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs. He had recommended bombing raids that killed civilians. He had made calculations that weighed lives against intelligence advantages. He had participated in a war machine that, however justified, caused immense suffering. These actions didn't align naturally with Jones's self-conception as a scientist devoted to understanding nature and improving human welfare. In his later writings, Jones occasionally addressed these psychological dimensions. He acknowledged sleepless nights spent wrestling with decisions, moments of doubt about whether chosen paths had been correct, and lasting discomfort with some aspects of his wartime role. But he also maintained that the war had been necessary, that Nazi Germany had represented an evil that justified extraordinary responses, and that his contributions had ultimately reduced suffering by helping to shorten the conflict. These reflections reveal someone who had thought deeply about the ethics of his wartime service and reached conclusions that provided some peace, but not complete resolution. Jones never became an opponent of scientific participation in defense work. He believed that when necessary, scientists had obligations to contribute to defending free societies. But he also became an advocate for careful ethical reflection about such participation and for consideration of long-term consequences of technical developments. One of Jones's most significant but subtle contributions was demonstrating how scientific methods could be applied to intelligence analysis. Before Jones, intelligence work was viewed as fundamentally different from scientific research. Intelligence was about secrets, deception, fragmentary information, and qualitative judgment. Science was about systematic observation, reproducible experiments, quantitative measurement, and peer review. Jones showed that these domains weren't as separate as they seemed. Intelligence analysis could be systematic, could follow explicit methodologies, could be subjected to verification through prediction and observation. The invisible war against German beam systems was essentially a scientific investigation, conducted under adversarial conditions. Jones's approach began with observation, collecting every available piece of information that might relate to German technical capabilities. This was analogous to how an experimental scientist collects data. The information sources were unusual: intercepted communications, reconnaissance photos, interrogations, captured equipment. But the principle of comprehensive data collection was the same. Next came hypothesis formation. Based on fragmentary evidence, Jones would formulate possible explanations for what he was observing. The beam navigation hypothesis emerged from synthesizing multiple weak signals, unusual references in intercepts, peculiar radio equipment, pilot statements, into a coherent theory. This was similar to how scientific theories are developed from disparate observations. Then came the crucial step: testable predictions. Jones's beam hypothesis predicted that specific radio signals should be detectable at specific frequencies if aircraft searched in the right locations. This was a falsifiable prediction. If the searches found nothing, the hypothesis would be disproven. This is the essence of scientific method. Theories must make predictions that can be tested empirically. When the predictions proved correct and beams were detected, Jones moved to detailed characterization. He measured beam properties systematically: frequencies, widths, signal characteristics, patterns. This was experimental science, quantifying phenomena to understand them comprehensively. Understanding led to intervention. Jones developed countermeasures based on scientific principles of radio propagation and electronic engineering. The countermeasures were themselves experiments, tests of whether theoretical interventions would produce predicted effects. When they succeeded, theories were confirmed. When they failed, theories needed revision. This entire cycle, observation, hypothesis, prediction, testing, characterization, intervention, is standard scientific method. Jones applied it in an intelligence context, showing that even when dealing with adversarial secrecy and incomplete information, rigorous, systematic thinking could produce reliable knowledge. Moreover, Jones demonstrated the value of probabilistic thinking in intelligence. Not every conclusion could be certain. Evidence was often ambiguous. But by assessing probability based on multiple independent sources, Jones could reach confident judgments even without absolute proof. This Bayesian approach, updating probability estimates as new evidence arrives, is now standard in intelligence analysis but was novel in Jones's era. Jones also showed how scientific skepticism could be an intelligence asset. His initial beam hypothesis was met with skepticism from others, but Jones himself maintained appropriate skepticism about his own conclusions. He constantly asked, what evidence would disprove this theory? What alternative explanations might account for the observations? This self-critical approach prevented premature commitment to incorrect theories and ensured that conclusions were proportionate to evidence. The peer review aspects of science also had parallels in Jones's intelligence work. While he couldn't publish findings for open review, he regularly presented analyses to colleagues, military officers, and scientific advisors. These presentations subjected his reasoning to scrutiny from multiple perspectives. Challenges and critiques forced Jones to strengthen arguments, address weaknesses, and acknowledge uncertainties. This collective assessment improved the quality of intelligence conclusions. Jones's scientific approach to intelligence had limitations. Science typically deals with natural phenomena that follow consistent laws, while intelligence deals with human adversaries who actively try to deceive and can change behavior unpredictably. Scientific experiments can often be repeated to verify results, while intelligence opportunities are usually unique and unrepeatable. Scientific findings can be shared for community validation, while intelligence must remain secret. Despite these differences, Jones demonstrated that scientific thinking, systematic observation, logical inference, probabilistic reasoning, skepticism, empirical testing provided powerful advantages in intelligence contexts. His wartime success validated this approach and established a model that subsequent intelligence organizations adopted, and elaborated modern intelligence analysis now explicitly incorporates scientific methods. Analysts are trained in structured analytic techniques that formalize hypothesis generation, evidence assessment, and probability estimation. Intelligence agencies employ scientists and engineers in technical intelligence roles. Academic programs teach intelligence studies using concepts from scientific methodology. These developments trace directly to Jones's pioneering work. He proved that intelligence needn't be an art practiced by intuitive experts, but could be a discipline with systematic methods that could be taught, improved, and applied consistently. This democratization of intelligence capabilities, making them less dependent on rare individuals with unusual gifts and more accessible to trained professionals using established methods, was perhaps as strategically significant as any specific technical achievement. Historical analysis often involves counterfactual questions. What would have happened if events had unfolded differently? For Jones and the Beam War, the relevant counterfactual is, what would have occurred if German beam systems had remained undetected and uncountered? This isn't idle speculation. By examining how events might have differed, we can better assess the actual significance of Jones's contributions. Several historians and strategic analysts have explored this question, and while conclusions involve uncertainty, Certain implications are clear. First, German bombing accuracy would have been substantially higher throughout 1940–1942. The actual bombing campaigns during this period achieved mixed results. Some raids caused significant damage. Others were largely ineffective due to bombs falling far from intended targets. With unimpeded beam guidance, German bombers could have consistently struck specific facilities: aircraft factories, power plants, port facilities, munitions works, transportation hubs. British industrial production would have suffered more severe disruptions. The British economy in 1940–1942 was operating under enormous strain, converting to wartime production while under constant attack. Systematic destruction of key facilities could have created cascading failures. Factories closed due to lack of power. Production delayed due to destroyed transportation networks. Shortages cascading through supply chains. Aircraft production is particularly significant. Britain desperately needed to replace fighter losses from the Battle of Britain and to expand bomber forces for future offensive operations. German beam-guided bombing could have systematically targeted the limited number of aircraft factories and engine plants that Britain possessed. Even partial success in disrupting aircraft production could have shifted the air power balance decisively. RAF airfields were also vulnerable. While Luftwaffe attacks on airfields during the Battle of Britain had some success, they weren't sustained effectively, partly due to navigation limitations. With beam guidance, German bombers could have persistently struck specific airfields, destroying runways, maintenance facilities, fuel stores, and aircraft on the ground. This could have rendered portions of RAF fighter command ineffective and opened gaps in Britain's air defense. Naval facilities and ports were critical targets. Britain depended on imports for survival. Food, fuel, raw materials all arrived by sea. The campaign against shipping in the Atlantic was Germany's most serious threat to Britain's viability. Complementing that campaign with precision bombing of port facilities could have created compounding effects. Even if ships evaded U-boats, they'd find ports damaged or destroyed, unable to offload cargo efficiently. Some historians argue that sustained, accurate German bombing could have made Britain's position untenable by mid-1941, potentially forcing negotiations before American entry into the war. This assessment may be too pessimistic. British society showed remarkable resilience and ability to disperse production, but it's not implausible. The psychological impact of suffering accurate, sustained bombing with no effective defense could have eroded civilian morale and political will. Beyond direct military implications, failure to detect and counter beam systems would have meant no intelligence about Peenemünde and the V-weapon programs. The V-2 rocket campaign that eventually occurred in 1944–1945 was launched at least 6 months later than originally planned, partly due to the 1943 bombing raid prompted by Jones's intelligence. Without that disruption, V-2 attacks might have begun in early 1944, coinciding with preparations for the D-Day invasion. A V-2 campaign during the build-up to D-Day would have been strategically significant. The invasion required enormous concentrations of troops and supplies in southern England. These concentrations were vulnerable to attack, but conventional bombing could be defended against. V-2 rockets were essentially uninterceptable with 1944 technology. Accurate V-2 strikes on embarkation ports, supply depots, or troop concentrations could have disrupted invasion preparations or inflicted casualties that delayed operations. Moreover, earlier V-2 deployment might have allowed more time for development of improved versions. Germany experimented with variants including longer-range rockets and versions equipped with guided warheads. None became operational during the actual war, but with more development time, some might have. A longer-range V-2 could have struck targets throughout Britain and potentially threatened Atlantic shipping routes or supply lines in France after D-Day. The most speculative but darkest counterfactual involves nuclear weapons. Germany's atomic program never came close to producing functional weapons during the actual war. But Jones's intelligence work that led to disrupting Pienemundo also interfered with broader advanced weapons research that had nuclear dimensions. If that interference hadn't occurred, and if German rocket and nuclear programs had developed unimpeded, the possibility of nuclear-armed V-2 rockets becomes grimly conceivable, though still quite unlikely given the technical challenges involved. Even without reaching such extreme scenarios, the counterfactual analysis suggests that Jones's work had profound strategic impact. By neutralizing German precision bombing capabilities, he helped preserve British industrial capacity and military infrastructure during the critical period when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. By exposing the Pienemundo programs, he disrupted advanced weapons development that could have complicated Allied operations later in the war. The counterfactual strengthens rather than diminishes appreciation of Jones's contributions. History doesn't remember the disasters that were prevented, only the victories that were achieved. Jones's invisible war prevented invisible disasters, bombing campaigns that never achieved their objectives, rocket attacks that came later and in smaller numbers than planned, nuclear scenarios that never materialized. The absence of catastrophe is easy to overlook, but perhaps represents the highest achievement. The story of Jones and the Beam War offers lessons that transcend its historical context. While specific technologies have evolved enormously since 1940, certain principles about technology, intelligence, warfare, and human decision-making remain relevant. First, technological superiority is never permanent. Germany's beam systems represented cutting-edge innovation that provided temporary advantage, but British countermeasures neutralized that advantage within months. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Innovation creates advantage. Adversaries respond. Advantage erodes, requiring further innovation. The cycle is endless. This has implications for contemporary defense planning. Nations invest enormous resources in developing advanced military technologies, stealth aircraft, precision weapons, cyber warfare capabilities, artificial intelligence systems. These technologies provide advantages, but adversaries are simultaneously working to counter them. Maintaining technological edge requires continuous innovation, not just initial breakthroughs. Second, intelligence is as important as capability. German beam systems would have been war-winning if they had remained secret and uncountered. The systems themselves didn't fail. British understanding and countermeasures defeated them. This highlights that protecting technological advantages requires effective security, while overcoming adversary advantages requires effective intelligence. Modern parallels are obvious. Nations protect their most sensitive military technologies with elaborate security measures precisely because they understand that once adversaries comprehend how systems work, countermeasures become possible. Conversely, intelligence agencies prioritize understanding adversary technical capabilities because such understanding enables disproportionate defensive or offensive responses. Third, small teams with appropriate expertise can achieve strategic impact. Jones's core team never exceeded a few dozen people, yet they neutralized systems that Germany had invested far more resources to develop. This demonstrates that in technical domains, quality and creativity can overcome quantitative disadvantages. This lesson challenges assumptions that military competition is purely a matter of resource expenditure. While resources matter, how they're applied matters more. A small group of exceptionally capable individuals working on the right problems can achieve more than large organizations pursuing marginal improvements or working on less critical issues. Fourth, interdisciplinary thinking provides advantages. Jones's effectiveness came partly from his ability to integrate multiple domains: physics, engineering, intelligence analysis, military strategy. He understood radio theory, thought about operational implications, assessed strategic consequences, and communicated effectively with both technical and military audiences. Modern challenges increasingly require such interdisciplinary approaches. Cyber warfare, for instance, involves computer science, intelligence operations, legal frameworks, strategic communications, and geopolitics. No single specialty provides sufficient perspective. Professionals who can integrate multiple domains have outsized impact. Fifth, ethical dilemmas in technological warfare are unavoidable and often unresolvable. Jones faced impossible choices about how to use intelligence, whether preventing immediate harm justified risks to long-term capabilities, and how to balance military effectiveness against moral constraints. Modern practitioners face parallel dilemmas with different technologies but similar fundamental tensions. There are no algorithmic solutions to these dilemmas. Technical capabilities create options, but choices among options require value judgments that depend on ethical frameworks, strategic priorities, and assessments of consequences. Jones's struggles with these questions demonstrate that discomfort and uncertainty are appropriate responses, not weaknesses to be eliminated. Sixth, secrecy has costs as well as benefits. The classified nature of Jones's work meant that most people were unaware of vulnerabilities he was addressing or threats he was countering. This created strategic advantages, but also meant that society couldn't fully participate in discussions about how capabilities should be developed or deployed. Modern classified programs face similar tensions. Classification protects capabilities from adversaries, but also limits democratic oversight and public discourse about acceptable uses of technology. Finding appropriate balances between secrecy and transparency remains challenging, with different societies and circumstances suggesting different equilibria. Seventh, defensive technologies and strategies are as important as offensive ones. Much military innovation focuses on more effective ways to project power or destroy targets. Jones's work shows the importance of defensive innovation, capabilities that protect against adversary actions or neutralize adversary advantages. Contemporary defense planning sometimes under-prioritizes defensive capabilities because they're less visible and harder to demonstrate than offensive systems. But resilience, redundancy, defensive technologies, and protective strategies are crucial for surviving initial attacks and maintaining capability under stress. Jones's countermeasures exemplify defensive innovation that was strategically decisive. Eighth, prediction based on fragmentary evidence is possible but imperfect. Jones successfully predicted German capabilities based on limited intelligence, but some predictions proved incorrect or incomplete. Perfect foresight is impossible, yet decisions must be made despite uncertainty. This highlights the importance of probabilistic thinking and adaptive planning. Intelligence assessments should provide probability estimates rather than false certainty. Plans should incorporate flexibility to adjust as situations develop and new information arrives. Overconfidence in predictions leads to brittle strategies that fail when reality diverges from expectations. Ninth, human factors remain central even in technological warfare. The Beam War was ultimately about people. Engineers designing systems, pilots flying missions, intelligence analysts interpreting evidence, military commanders making decisions. Technology shaped options, but humans made choices. Contemporary discussions about artificial intelligence and autonomous systems sometimes suggest that human factors might become less important. But even highly automated systems reflect human design choices, serve human-defined objectives, and operate within contexts shaped by human decisions. Understanding human psychology, organizational behavior, decision-making under uncertainty, and cognitive biases remains crucial for effective military operations. 10th, historical understanding informs present challenges. Studying Jones's work provides insights not because modern technologies resemble 1940s beam systems, but because the challenges Jones faced, detecting unknown capabilities, developing countermeasures under time pressure, balancing competing priorities, making decisions with incomplete information, remain relevant. History doesn't repeat exactly, but patterns recur. This suggests value in studying historical cases of technological warfare, intelligence operations, and strategic decision-making. Not to extract simple lessons that can be mechanically applied, but to develop intuition about how complex socio-technical systems behave. What strategies prove effective under different circumstances, and what pitfalls commonly occur. The story of Dr. Reginald Victor Jones and the battle against Hitler's hidden strategy exemplifies a truth about modern warfare. Many of the most consequential battles are never seen by the public, never recorded in dramatic combat footage, never commemorated with monuments. They're fought by small teams of specialists, often civilians in uniform, working in obscurity with tools most people don't understand, against threats most never knew existed. Jones's achievement was to recognize the impossible as real, to convince skeptics through systematic evidence gathering and analysis, to develop technical countermeasures under impossible deadlines, and to wage an invisible war that saved thousands of lives and preserved Britain's ability to resist Nazi Germany. He did this while wrestling with profound moral dilemmas and enduring personal costs that he rarely discussed publicly. The Beam War, ultimately, represented a triumph of scientific thinking, applied to military intelligence. Jones demonstrated that systematic observation, logical inference, creative problem-solving, and rigorous analysis could defeat sophisticated technical threats. He showed that small teams with appropriate expertise could achieve strategic impact disproportionate to their resources. He established methods for scientific and technical intelligence that remain foundational to modern practice. But beyond methodology and technical achievement, Jones's story is about human qualities, persistence in the face of skepticism, courage to propose unconventional ideas, willingness to accept responsibility for consequential decisions, and integrity to honestly assess both successes and failures. These qualities enabled Jones to see what others missed, to convince others of what he saw, and to develop effective responses to threats that could have changed the war's outcome. The invisible victory Jones achieved receives less attention than conventional military triumphs because it lacks obvious drama. No iconic photographs capture the moment when German beam systems were neutralized. No famous speeches commemorate the countermeasures that prevented precision bombing campaigns. No popular films dramatize intelligence analysts poring over technical data in cramped offices. Yet the impact was profound. British cities that might have burned remained intact. Factories that might have been systematically destroyed continued producing aircraft and weapons. Military installations that might have been precisely targeted remained operational. And advanced weapons programs that might have prolonged the war or altered its outcome were disrupted before reaching full effectiveness. Jones never sought fame for these achievements. He returned to academic life after the war, teaching physics and conducting research far from the classified world of intelligence and military operations. When he eventually wrote about his wartime experiences, he did so modestly, emphasizing the contributions of colleagues and avoiding self-aggrandizement. But history's assessment must be that Jones's work was genuinely exceptional. He saw patterns in fragmentary evidence that others dismissed. He understood technical principles deeply enough to predict enemy capabilities and devise countermeasures. He navigated complex bureaucratic and military hierarchies to implement recommendations, and he bore the weight of decisions that balanced intelligence. Advantages against immediate human costs, the radical radar. Idea that unmasked Hitler's hidden strategy wasn't actually about radar in the narrow sense. It was about understanding that invisible electromagnetic phenomena could be detected, analyzed, and manipulated for strategic advantage. Jones recognized that modern warfare would increasingly be fought in invisible domains. Radio spectrum, electronic systems, technical capabilities, and that victory would require scientific intelligence capabilities that barely existed when the war began. By creating those capabilities and demonstrating their effectiveness, Jones contributed not just to Allied victory in World War II, but to the evolution of intelligence and military practice. Every modern intelligence agency that employs scientists and engineers to assess technical threats, every electronic warfare system that protects military forces from adversary sensors and weapons, every strategic decision informed by systematic technical intelligence, all descend from methods Jones pioneered under the desperate circumstances of 1940. The lessons of the Beam War remain relevant precisely because the fundamental challenges recur even as specific technologies change. How do you detect capabilities adversaries want to conceal? How do you assess threats you haven't directly observed? How do you develop responses to dangers that seem technically impossible? How do you make ethical decisions about using capabilities that could save some lives but cost others? How do you balance immediate crises against long-term strategic positioning? Jones didn't solve these challenges definitively. They're inherently unresolvable in any permanent sense, but he demonstrated approaches that proved effective in his context and that provide guidance for addressing similar challenges in different circumstances. That may be the ultimate measure of strategic genius, not solving problems that stay solved, but developing methods that remain useful as contexts evolve. The story concludes not with a single dramatic moment, but with the gradual realization, as the war progressed, that Germany's revolutionary technical advantages had been systematically neutralized. German bombers could no longer strike with impunity. German commanders could no longer rely on precision guidance systems. German advanced weapons programs had been disrupted, and throughout, German leadership never fully understood how this had happened, how their most carefully guarded technical secrets had been penetrated and countered by an enemy they thought was technologically inferior. That misperception, that technological advantage was permanent, and that British countermeasures were impossible, was itself a kind of blindness induced by the invisible war Jones fought. Germany couldn't see the countermeasures because they operated in the same invisible electromagnetic domain as the systems being countered. They couldn't detect the intelligence operation because Jones was careful to leave ambiguous traces that permitted multiple interpretations, and they couldn't respond effectively because, by the time they realized the full scope of British capabilities, the strategic moment had passed. In the end, one engineer's radical idea that invisible radio beams could be detected and manipulated did indeed unmask Hitler's hidden strategy. But more fundamentally, Jones demonstrated that intelligence, creativity, and systematic scientific thinking could triumph over resource advantages and technical innovation. He showed that defense, intelligently conducted, could neutralize offense. He proved that small teams could defeat larger organizations if they understood problems more deeply and responded more adaptively. These are the invisible victories that shape history as much as visible battles. Perhaps more so. They're harder to recognize, harder to celebrate, harder to learn from because they involve preventing disasters that never occur rather than overcoming disasters that do. But they're no less real and no less important. Dr. Reginald Victor Jones fought such a war and won such a victory. His story deserves to be remembered not just as historical curiosity, but as enduring demonstration of how human intelligence, both in the sense of mental capability and in the sense of systematic information gathering, can overcome seemingly impossible challenges and alter the course of history.